soft intros. Yeah, I want everyone to feel very comfortable of being off mute and asking questions. But I guess first I'll start off by saying I'm Kira Hardy. I'm the coordinator of the Beginning and Young Alaskan Farmers Network, and you're here at the second installment of our Farmer Skillshare sessions. And today we're going to be hearing from Sam Knapp of Offbeet Farms in Fairbanks,
When's your
Alaska.
Skillshare?
It's right now. It's happening. Everyone's just kind of showing up.
Yeah, it's happening. And thank you for being here. And take it away, Sam.
Okay, sounds great. Like Kira said, I'm Sam Knapp. I run Offbeet Farm in Fairbanks. The farm focuses entirely on storage crops. So my sales season starts in mid-October, and I sell through whenever I run out. It's usually like mid to late April, depending on how things go. And I'm in the process of finishing a book on cold storage. And so I've had a chance to talk with a bunch of farmers who do this from all over the country and learn their wisdom on it. Because I'm relatively speaking, I've been doing this for 7 years, and so I'm still a storage baby, and it's nice to learn from the storage adults out there how they've been doing it and kind of seeing what works, because there's definitely not one way to do this. There's a bunch of ways to do this. And so just keep that in mind when I'm going through stuff today, that like, just because I do something one way doesn't mean you have to do something that way. There's many ways to do things. And so I'll try to present different options as I go. I presented a version of this talk last week at, I forget, for somebody, but they weren't farmers. And so I've adjusted it to be more farm focused, which I'm very excited about. So let's see, oh no, I can't share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, so that means I'm going to relinquish my host powers to you, but then I cannot help you mute people. So remember, everyone, I mean, I want you to be off mute, but if we're having background conversations, let's try and be as thoughtful as possible. And I am making you host.
Okay. Feel the power.
Yeah.
There we go. Got it. Share the screen, and my screen is up. I'm going to put this onto full screen mode, if I can remember how to do that. It's in here somewhere. Let's see. Oh no, I'm forgetting how to use this, everybody. Open view window. Is this it? All the things that you forget to do in a week. Oh, we'll just roll with this. This is good enough. Okay. So storing veggies through the winter. So like I mentioned, I am at Offbeet Farm. Here's a photo of the farm. We do about an acre of veggie production, and it's all on 30-inch beds, kind of JM Fortier style. Out of that acre, or it's a little less than an acre right now, we'll be expanding to an acre hopefully in the next year or two. We're getting between 20 and 25,000 pounds out every year. We do a lot of root crops, but we kind of get the scope of what we're doing. That building that you see behind me is, that's where the magic happens. It's the cold storage building, where we do all of our winter storage of everything from winter squash to carrots. Here's a view of the cold room itself. So that building is kind of divided in half. Half of it I use for doing packing stuff in the summer or during the winter time. And the other half I keep at 32 degrees and pretty much as high humidity as I can get it. I do a lot of my storing in these large white super sacks, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But this room is where I'm keeping everything through the winter time. When we talk about what we can do in Alaska, what veggies we can store, our options are kind of limited. There are a few more options if you lived in the South. You could do sweet potatoes, but we can do pumpkins and squash. There are certainly squash varieties that can mature in time in Fairbanks and elsewhere in the state. Onions are kind of a challenge in the interior for some light issues with storage onions. Our day length ends up being a little bit too long for many variety of storage onions, and so they don't reach full size by the time they fully mature. Red Wing is one that I've found. I think Johnny sells it. It's adapted to 65 degrees north, and so it's a good storage option. You can grow some other large onions like Alyssa Craig's and Walla Walla Sweets that will do well here, but they don't store as long. All the brassicas are options. Cabbages store great. Brussels sprouts you can put into storage for a while along with kale. I wouldn't expect to get more than 2 months out of either of those, but the rest of them, like kohlrabi, rutabagas, winter radishes, and turnips, you can take through most of the winter time with some losses in cases. Then there's the other classic root crops like carrots and parsnips, celeriac, beets, and sunchokes, which are Jerusalem artichokes. Potatoes, I kind of think of the class of their own because they store a little bit differently than everything else. Okay, so this is a chart. I might refer back to this, but this is something that I published a few years ago in Growing for Market. And you don't need to read everything on here, just including the whole thing so that you can like see the legend. I think this is just kind of getting us into our conversation about harvesting veggies and kind of what to expect for cold tolerance, because I think cold tolerance is one of those like really important things for making sure that your veggies aren't getting damaged around harvest time. I do like to leave veggies in the field as long as I can, so long as I have enough time to finish the harvest on time. If I'm growing smaller amounts, I really like to push the harvest back as far as I can. There's a couple of reasons for that. Having veggies come into the cooler cold means that your coolers don't have to work as hard. Cooling veggies fast is really important. So if you're harvesting things on a warm day, it's like 60 degrees, 70 degrees. Ideally, you want things, especially in this first kind of like blue, cold and damp group, you want these to be cooled down below 40 degrees within 24 hours. So it really helps if they're already cold because you're harvesting late into the season. Another thing to note is that also you're leaving things out there as long as you can, but not everything can tolerate the same amount of cold. So like I think carrots and parsnips are great examples of crops that can tolerate a lot of cold, and that's why I've given them 2 snowflakes in this figure. Most of carrots and parsnips are below ground, and so they can deal with a little bit of frozen soil. I've spent time digging carrots out of frozen soil. It's not fun. You'll sometimes see a little bit of damage to the root crowns that can be trimmed off. Parsnips, though, they can freeze a little bit and they'll come back from it. A lot of the other veggies that we consider like classic storage crops are mostly above ground or have a large portion of the parts that we eat above ground. I think beets are a great example of this. Beets can tolerate some frost, but you really, really don't want to expose them to hard frosts. You'll see some like pockmarking on the root surface that may be fine for a month or 2, but it's definitely going to mold fast in storage when you're taking it out months and months. Cabbages, I mean, most brassicas, along with cabbages, can deal with some freezing. But again, you really don't want to like have a hard freeze on that surface, because any of that tissue that is frozen and then thawed ends up molding in storage after a few months. So like rutabagas are a good example of that. Definitely don't want rutabaga flesh to freeze. Cabbages have the nice advantage that you can peel back layers if you see freezing damage, although it is a pain in the butt. A lot of these crops, I think rutabagas is a good example, have a lot of leaf cover, and so you can maybe get away with a little bit more cold exposure than you could with something else. Potatoes, I think, are an interesting case because their foliage is not tolerant to frost at all, but often you want the vines to be exposed to frost because it starts the process of them setting their skins and those tubers beginning to mature in the ground. The tubers themselves are really not tolerant to cold.
Yeah. I
If
got this.
you, oh, go ahead. Is there a question?
Mom,
I will continue on. So potato tubers, if they are exposed to frozen soil, if you have any freezing in a potato, it is going to spell problems for you because sometimes not the entire tuber freezes and you'll have these little pockets of rot that just bloom into absolutely nasty things in storage. Potatoes are just the worst when they go bad. It's the smell of death. Nothing else can quite describe it. Winter squash and pumpkins are something that, you know, I sometimes hear people talking about getting away with letting them be exposed to frost, but I really try not to, for the same reasons as everything else, that even a little bit of frost damage can screw up storage for them. So I just don't risk it. Yeah, we've been talking a little bit about harvest timing. So again, I like to keep everything as late as I can into the season, but that's fine for a home gardener if you have like a very small amount, but we're farmers and we have a lot to harvest. And so you're going to have to balance that timing of like trying to push everything late with making sure that you can get everything done. And part of that is knowing like how long it takes you to do things. And another part of that is kind of like knowing your systems and finding slow spots that can be improved upon, either through making things more efficient, getting better equipment that makes you more efficient, or like hiring more employees. I'm going to skip over some stuff. Along those lines, like I want to talk about how I kind of frame the harvest window when I'm planning. So all of those crops are going to come out, you know, in one kind of harvest window, with the exception for me of garlic and onions. In Fairbanks and in many other locations, garlic is going to mature sometime in August, usually early August, or earlier in the summer for some people. Onions are going to mature sometime in late August. Whereas everything else I'm harvesting in this window in kind of mid-September. I'll just pause to say that the chart in front of you is something that I pull off the National Weather Service website. You can get this for your location. It's just past weather data. So these are daily mean temperatures, like historical mean temperatures for each day of the year. And there are two numbers that I really pay attention to when kind of framing the harvest window. One is when temperatures, so the daily means, drop below 50. 50 degrees is special because that's the borderline or the threshold for winter squash and pumpkins beginning to accumulate chilling injury. Chilling injury is something that won't damage them immediately, but after weeks of exposure, it shortens their storage life. So it may take 3 or 4 weeks of exposure to like noticeably see the effects on a winter squash, but even like a few days of temperatures below 50 may shorten their storage life by a week or two, you know, come late in the season. So I'm trying to hit that window when, okay, this is when I'm going to start thinking about harvesting my winter squash, is around this time when the mean daily temperatures are dropping below 50. On the other end of that is when mean daily temperatures drop below 32, because that's when the ground starts to freeze. And again, there are some crops like carrots and parsnips that we can harvest from frozen ground, but it is terrible. Don't put yourself through that. Once you spend a day or a week chiseling carrots out of frozen ground, you'll thank yourself by getting some good planning in there. So these dates aren't set in stone each year. You know, obviously weather patterns change from year to year, but this just kind of gives you a rough idea of when your harvest window will be and when everything should be maturing in the field. So I know, for example, that, you know, I start my harvest usually right after Labor Day. So that's like 3rd, 4th of September. And I have until, on average about the 10th of October to get everything out. I usually plan to get everything out by the 1st or 2nd, just because weather patterns change from year to year and I'm afraid of risking it. So that gives me about a month. And so I have to plan my harvest accordingly to make sure that I have enough time to get everything done. We'll look at this next. Some crops, it matters a lot that you're harvesting them when they have reached physiological maturity. And there are some that it's not important at all. Kind of over on the right side of the page here is a list of crops that maturity is not really important. Size is important for your sales, for your customers' preferences. But for example, a small head of cabbage that hasn't really firmed up yet will last just as long in storage as a big, firm head of cabbage. Same goes for rutabagas, radishes, carrots, these small veggies, with the exception of being a little bit more sensitive to desiccating if the humidity is low. The small veggies will last just as long as fully large mature veggies in these cases. Now, the one note is that kale, if you're bringing kale into storage, the smallest kale leaves, so the least mature kale leaves, which will be at the top of the plant, they'll be in the curly kales, the most curly ones. Those will last considerably longer in storage without yellowing compared to the mature ones, which will be either full-sized or even starting to kind of spread their leaves out. So like you'll see curly kale leaves near the bottom of the plant that are flattened out and are a little bit less curly. Those ones are going to be the first to senesce in storage and give you issues. So that's one to keep an eye on. For the rest of these, though, the maturity does matter. And here are some signs to look for to know that your veggies are mature and ready to harvest. So with pumpkins and squash, kind of the classic signs that people talk about, especially in the lower 48, is corking stems and the dieback of the foliage. I can't always reach this stage in Fairbanks, and sometimes I'm like barely eking out getting my squash mature. So I have to look for other ways to tell that they're mature. Kind of a foolproof way, or like something that you'll notice right when squash are on the edge of being mature, is that their rind or the skin of the squash will turn from the shiny appearance and it'll have these little trichomes or hairs on it to turning kind of, it loses its luster. It has a waxy appearance and those little hairs would be gone. And that's when that happens, your squash is really close to being mature and ready for harvest. For orange flesh varieties, the flesh, that orange color will really develop as they're getting closer to that point. And if you can sacrifice a few and look at the seeds will start to plump out. And that's the sign that they're ready, that you could harvest them. And if you can successfully dry the stems, that they'll do well in storage. Onions, people a lot of times talk about falling tops. If you're living in a very wet area, sometimes if you're waiting for falling tops, you're going to have fungal issues. You've waited too long. So the sign of physiological maturity with onions is that their necks begin to soften, and you can feel it by squeezing them. On an immature onion, it'll just be rock hard. And as the onion is getting close to physiological maturity, it'll start to give a little bit when you squeeze it, and that's a sign that it's ready. You can do something at that point like crimping. You can roll the onions to begin their dry down process. Garlic, they should have, garlic shows by the bottom leaves will start to yellow or senesce, and kind of the borderline that people talk about is when half of those leaves have turned yellow from the bottom. Again, if you're living in a really wet area, sometimes you can't always wait for that. So one thing to look for is that the shoulders of the garlic have developed. If you harvest a garlic too early, it might have more of like a torpedo shape, whereas when it's physiologically mature, the shoulders kind of fill out to have almost like a flat area on top. You can also cut into the garlic itself, and you'll see that the cloves have begun to totally fill out their wrappers. If they're not totally like tight on the wrappers, they're usually not ready. Potatoes, potatoes are interesting because you can technically harvest them at any time and have like, new potatoes if they're not ready. But when potatoes become fully mature, they stop growing, or the tubers stop growing, and that's linked closely to what's going on above ground. And it's something that you can force if you need to. For best storage, you're going to want to wait 1 to 3 weeks after the leaves have died back. And that can happen naturally, or if you're pressed for time, you can make it happen. Some farms torch their potato plants to make them die back, or other farms like brush hog them in order to make them die back. And then you'll wait a few weeks after that, and your potato tubers will be ready for storage. Sunchokes, the last one on the list, you want to wait until after a frost. Really, anytime after they frost or after they're exposed to a frost, they're going to have the best flavor. Some of those enzymes in the tubers are going to be getting ready to let them go dormant and last a long time in storage. One last thing is that you're going to want to bring in healthy crops into the storage room. This is a photo from my last farm in Michigan, and this particular year I had a big fungal issue happen on the cabbage, and I had to peel back a whole bunch of layers in order to bring like healthy cabbage pieces into the storage room. If you're bringing in obvious disease, obvious damage that hasn't healed over in a carrying process, you're going to want to try and sell those up front because, yeah, bringing in damage into storage, you're just asking for trouble, I guess. You know, if you have a big pile of something, the saying that one bad apple ruins the bunch is often true. If you have one thing go bad in the middle of something, it'll ruin kind of everything around it. So just be careful about bringing in stuff that's fully healthy. Okay, let's move on to talk about harvesting. So a lot of the root crops you're going to need to trim. It's similar on a lot of them. This is a picture of beet, obviously. Beets and carrots and turnips. I'll show rutabagas in a second because they're a little bit different, but they all have this very abbreviated stem that the leaves are growing out of at the top of the root shoulders. And trimming these crops is a lot like cutting fingernails, where you want to cut as much of the petiole off as you can without cutting into the quick. And so it's like you're cutting your fingernails. You don't want to make yourself bleed. You don't want to cut into the root tissue itself because that exposes it to pathogens, which can shorten its storage life. So generally speaking, you want to cut as much of the leaf material off as you can. Here I'm cutting. Some farmers like to rip. It's really up to you and what you think of for aesthetics. I know plenty of farmers who rip their beet tops off and it goes just fine for them. Rutabagas are a little bit different in that they have a slightly elongated stem coming out at the top of the root shoulder. And so you're going to be cutting into the stem, which is a little bit different. If anybody is growing celeriac out there, I think I have a photo of it later. It's not something that I've grown recently, but talking to farmers who do grow it regularly and store it, they usually trim the tops to less than 1 inch and cut as much as they can the whole tangled root mass off to get as much of that soil off as possible. So you're not bringing all that dirt into the washing process. It'll be a lot easier to wash and bring less moisture into storage. One more thing with the rutabagas, sometimes with rutabagas, radishes, turnips, you'll have root maggot damage on them. Rutabagas are pretty resilient trimming, so you can trim off that root maggot damage. You can see like this one, for example, has had a chunk of it trimmed off. I usually trim off that whole fine root wad, so I'm not bringing as much dirt into storage. But you can get away with that with rutabagas. Turnips is not as good. So if you trim a big section of insect damage off a turnip, that's going to go bad pretty quick in storage. Harvesting equipment. One of my favorites and something that I use on my farm is I use a harvest broad fork. So this is obviously the hand scale. I think it goes a lot faster than using a regular digging fork. So we use this with crops like carrots and parsnips, beets sometimes. Like beets, the kind of the big ones that sit on top, you don't really have as much trouble getting those to just pull out. But garlic can be in there. Yeah, parsnips are a big one. But I'm a big advocate of the Harvest Broad Fork. It'll make you twice as fast, and I think it's worth the money. But for farms that are not at a hand scale, and I think that's a place that many of us want to go, not everybody, but it's worth knowing. Oh, one more thing. Harvest knives. I have a plethora of knives. You should have many knives to choose from. Keep your knives sharp. I've gotten in the habit of painting my things orange or putting flagging tape around them just to stop from losing them in the field. But sharp knives are going to make for better cuts. Can't tell you enough how frustrating it is when you have a dull knife and you're leaving ragged edges because your knife is dull. Well, it may lead to issues in storage because you're not sharpening your knives. Moving up the chain here with harvesting equipment that is above the hand scale. Sorry, this is the only image I pulled from Google just because I wanted to show that the BCS does have some harvesting equipment. I think the only one really worth noting are its potato diggers. I wouldn't use them for anything other than potatoes or maybe sunchokes. They're just going to chop off other root crops. But they do have these options. So if you're running your farm at a scale of a BCS, do know that this Speedo kind of one row potato digger is an option for you. And this is just going to bring tubers to the root surface or to the soil surface. On even larger farms, they have fun equipment that I love nerding out about. This is a photo of Scott Viner root harvester. This was a machine that was originally developed in the 30s for harvesting beets and has become very popular for small farmers with carrots in particular. You can't buy these new. These are all used machines that people have taken care of or refurbished, but these basically work by running. This is a full-size tractor machine. So it runs a digging shoe under the roots that you're harvesting, and above that at the same time are two parallel belts that will pinch the tops and then lift them up as they go. So these carrots are being lifted. They'll run along that belt and then they'll come to a topping knife that will top off the greens, and then the carrots will be funneled via a conveyor belt into a waiting bin. You can harvest, I've heard of people harvesting like 3,000 pounds an hour with these things. It's pretty awesome. It's not a scale that I'm at in my farm, but if I have a different larger farm someday, maybe this is something I'll move to. There are even bigger machines. This one is from some farmers in Washington. It is, I'm forgetting the brand of this one, but this is a similar root harvester. They're using it for celeriac. Some of these other, so Scott Viners are pretty limited to like carrots and beets and maybe parsnips and turnips, but some of these other machines can handle an even wider variety of crops. Here they're harvesting celeriac into a large macro bin. So just to be aware that these things exist, these kind of labor saving equipment things. But if you're on the hand scale, I highly encourage you to think about getting a broad fork. If you have a tractor, that's something that I didn't include in this presentation or in the slideshow, is getting an undercutter bar if you have a full size tractor, because you can make the process of pulling all of your root crops like carrots and parsnips and things much faster if you run an undercutter bar or a bed lifter under them first, because then you won't have to dig them out. They'll all be loosened. It's something that I'm looking into getting either this season or maybe the next, just to really speed up my harvest. Curing. Okay. So many crops, or sorry, some crops that we can grow here usually need a curing step in order to do their best in storage.
Hey, Sam, could
yep.
I barge in there for a minute? Did you say a cutter bar, like in a mower cutter bar?
No, an undercutter bar.
Undercutter bar. Okay.
Yep. And there, you'll also see them called bed lifters. They come in all sorts of widths. I think usually a tractor needs to be at least 20 to 25 horse to drag one, because it'll be dragging this bar 12 to 18 inches below the soil surface, and usually you need weights on it. to hold it down.
Any idea who sells those?
I think Tillmore makes one. That's the one I'm thinking about getting. I know that people, because it's just a 3-point hitch mount, like there's no hydraulics in it. I know if there are people who weld their own, it's a pretty simple implement. I think the Mayos here in town that run Spinach Creek Farm, I'm pretty sure their undercutter bar is something that they welded themselves. And they run one under their carrots but prior to harvesting, so they don't need to dig them up.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so moving on to curing. Winter squash and pumpkins. So I'll start that in the lower 48, many farmers can cure their pumpkins and squash in the field and everything's fine. They don't need to do this curing step. It's so sunny and warm and dry in the fall that and their growing season is so long that these squash have dried stems and hardened grinds and everything they need to do well in storage. In Fairbanks, I'm barely eking out getting these squash to mature on time. Their stems are not corked and they're very wet. And so they need this curing step to remove moisture from the stems, finish the hardening process in the rinds, and develop, kind of most importantly, what happens during curing is that these squash are developing sugars, converting some starches into simple sugars in their flesh, which helps them store for longer. So with winter squash, something that I do is I bring them inside. I let them sit in the sun as long as I can, but depending on the temperature or rainfall coming, I usually need to bring them in within a day or two. So I'll leave them, I'm shooting for 80 degrees and I run a dehumidifier running around 50 to 60% relative humidity, and I'll leave them there for like 10 days or more. Kind of watching the stems or actually the stem, here's a fun fact, the stems are called peduncles. I'm watching the stems to see that they've dried down. If you have a moist stem that you put into storage, it is going to rot from the top down and you will be sad. Onions are another thing that need curing. The temperature is less, you can be a little loosey-goosey with the temperature, but preferably as warm and as dry as you can get it. With a lot of air circulation for 3 to 5 weeks. This is not my farm. This is a farm near Winnipeg, Canada. A lot of farmers, myself included, like to spread onions out in single layers. I have heard of farmers putting them into large macro bins and then like putting a fan on top to suck air through the bins. But I think they're in warmer and drier climates than we are. So it's not something that I've been successful with. Garlic, pretty similar to onions. You want them to be fully dry. Well, I should go back to onions. Onions are ready. They're fully dry when the scales are crinkly to the touch. It's fully dry. There's no moisture in the necks. That is when they are fully dry and ready for further cleaning or to be brought into storage. Garlic, pretty similar. This photo is taken from Farragut Farm in Petersburg. And I think if they can cure garlic off grid, anybody can cure garlic, given how cool and wet it is there. They do this curing in a section of their greenhouse. You can see they put some row cover up to protect the garlic from sun scalding, because direct sun exposure on garlic is not good for it and they can actually get damaged by that. To remove as much moisture as possible, and I do this too, I clip my garlic pretty short prior to curing it. Not all the way down, because you risk exposing the neck to pathogens, but I'm usually going about 6 inches. And I think they're doing a similar thing here. And they're clipping all the roots off prior to curing as well. Potatoes, many people cure the potatoes in the same location that they're going to store them, just by manipulating the temperature. Potatoes, the curing step it suberizes them, and suberin is like a waxy covering that heals up wounds and protects them from pathogens coming in through the skins. They also set their skins. A lot of people think the skins get thicker, but the skins actually just become more attached to the cells below them. In order for this to happen, you can keep your potatoes like 80% relative humidity is perfect and stop them from drying out, but also not be so humid that fungus is going to form. Anywhere between 55 and 75 degrees is fine. Although the lower you go in temperature, the slower they'll cure, but you'll have fewer issues with fungus. So I prefer to cure my potatoes when I grew them. I don't grow them actually anymore. I would cure them at the lower temperature, and I didn't see any issues with it. Okay. Washing. So a lot of, well, not the crops that you're curing, but many of the crops that you need to put into storage, you need to wash at some point prior to selling them. When I was getting into storage, I was really uncertain about if I could wash things before I store them or if I had to wait until after I store them to wash them. And the answer, it turns out, is yes, you can do either. I think a lot of the advice that says you shouldn't wash crops up front is most pertinent to folks who are not getting their storage rooms cold enough. So that's like more of the traditional root cellar, kind of passive cold storage. I think that if you're washing things and you're bringing them into a space that's not cold enough, all the small injuries that come in washing and that extra moisture are going to fester. But if your cold room is hovering right at freezing, right at 32 degrees, you can definitely wash things up front. Most farmers do it. It's a logistical decision for me. It's just much easier to wash in the fall than it is in the winter. So I wash everything up front. As far as the way that you wash, there's a bunch of cool tools out there. This photo is from my farm. This is a root barrel washer that I built using plans similar to what you'll find on Farm Hack. There's a set of plans out there for a barrel washer. I did deviate a little bit from their plans when it came to the motor sizing and kind of chain sizing, but I'll show you kind of the evolution of this barrel washer and some other examples out there. So this was the version 1.0 of barrel washer on my farm. It's a simple frame built out of treated lumber. I found an old section of culvert that was laying in the woods, and it just so happened that some caster wheels fit perfectly into those grooves. And so you could have this culvert spinning on the caster wheels. At this point, I didn't have any motor, and you can see how there's like these wooden strips fixed to the outside. And so I turned it by hand. I would spray the veggies, turn it a little bit, spray them again, turn it a little bit, and on that went. And it worked great for the first couple of years. I think I put like 10,000 pounds of stuff through this one season, and it was fine. I did put some like half pieces of PVC in there to act as agitators to make sure the veggies were spinning, but it worked okay. But I definitely think that this version was a huge improvement, saving a bunch of time and wear and tear on my shoulder for turning it. Here's some other barrel washers out there. This one comes from Spanish Creek farm in Fairbanks. This one is pretty neat. It's designed similarly to Johnny's Tilther in that it is powered by a cordless drill, which I think is pretty darn cool. They do a thing like many barrel washers. Instead of spraying like mine, there's no water in the inside. This is a choice for water conservation on my farm, and we spray with a pressure washer that actually doesn't use that much water. I think it's like 1.5 gallons a minute. Many farms choose to have a pipe running on the inside of their barrel washer so that it can just run and you don't need to be spraying and the veggies are getting clean. Maybe that's something I'll move to. So note that they have this kind of custom-made barrier that stops the carrots from rolling out, or whatever you're washing from rolling out. Here's another example. This one again comes from Farragut Farm in Petersburg, running off a DC motor. It is bike rims. is the thing that they used to fix the wood to. And they're running the bike rims on these caster wheels here. The DC electric motor is running a rubber belt, and that's how the thing turns. And Bo put the whole thing onto a frame with bike wheels, and so they can move it around. So kind of the sky's the limit. I think barrel washers are really useful. You can put a lot of stuff through them, and it's something that you can, with a little bit of effort, build yourself. If you don't feel like building barrel washer, I still encourage you to, you can keep it simple. This is this photo isn't great because you can't see the spray table beneath the carrots, but there's a spray table under there. It's just a simple frame with 2x4s and some hardwood cloth. And a pain of using a spray table, and I'm sure many of you know this, is that there's always going to be dirt underneath of what you're spraying, and you have to flip them over and over and over again, which is why people, I think, thought of the barrel washer, because it's constantly rolling them and exposing a new side to be cleaned. This is a farm in Winnipeg. They harvest like 40,000 pounds of storage crops every year, and they wash everything on spray tables. I think they have a cool system that they're harvesting into these bread crates, which can then be directly sprayed into, so they never have to like transfer crops. Saves a lot of handling time. But just goes to show that you can do kind of medium-ish scales and still be running on spray tables. This photo shows not only some washing equipment, but some grading equipment. The washing equipment in the back, I didn't have any great photos of this, but there's a Pennsylvania-based company called AZS, which if somebody had stuff shipped up here from them, that would be amazing. It's awesome stuff that they make. They have a barrel washer back here, and in front of that is a brush washer, which does a great job it's a bunch of spinning brushes, and it does a great job of really polishing up crops, especially I think carrots that have been in storage a long time. It really polishes them nicely. Over here is a rinse conveyor. A lot of farmers use these for more delicate crops. You can kind of think of it like a throughput dishwasher, but for veggies. You can recirculate the water, have sanitizer in there. Some people use it for winter squash to sanitize the outside of them. Sweet potato growers love these things because they're really gentle on the crops, and sweet potatoes are very sensitive to being damaged. Something to note here is that they have this big grading table. So usually after you're done washing is a point at which you're going to be grading your crops. The point of grading is to remove things that are not going to be things that you're selling. So you may have limited storage space, and there's really no point in bringing in crops that you're never going to be able to sell into storage. And so you're grading those things out. You're grading out disease that you couldn't see before washing, damage that you couldn't see before washing. Sometimes farmers are actually separating grades at this point. This isn't something that I do until I'm actually packing orders. I'll usually leave like very small carrots that are too small for my bag varieties that I'm selling wholesale. I'll separate those out while I'm packing orders, and then I'll bag up mini carrots later on because people love small things for some reason. This is my grading setup, really simple. After things are coming out of the barrel washer, I'm just putting them onto this table, which is a chunk of countertop that I got at the transfer station, as we do. And it just gives me an opportunity to inspect the veggies after they've come out of the washer, again, to remove things that aren't going to be saleable for whatever reason, or are damaged or weird, that I just don't want to be putting into storage. Then comes the task of packing things into storage, and I think there's a lot of confusion around this. Your storage containers that you're using are going to depend a lot on what's going on in your storage space. Many people, their storage space is too dry. So most of the kind of classic root crops want to be at near saturation humidity, so as close to 100% as you can get it. And if it's not above 95% or so, you'll see things drying out in storage and becoming floppy or soft over time. And the way that you can get around that is by using containers that hold in the moisture. I call these semi-permeable containers. What you don't want to do is you don't want to seal things up completely. If you seal things up completely, that is inevitably when carrots, beets, whatever, they're going to turn to goo over time. Every farmer I've talked to who's done it, including myself, has seen that problem when we've sealed containers too tightly. What you want though is you want to allow enough airflow that your veggies aren't turning to goo, but not so much that you're losing moisture to your dry storage room. And finding that balance is really just a matter of trial and error. So you want enough, a good indicator of that is if you open these containers. So I use these 27-gallon totes that you get at Home Depot or whatever for storing some of my more specialty crops. It's just a convenient thing. It's things that I had laying around from when the storage room was drier. And I pepper these things with holes so that there is an amount of airflow happening in these bins. But if I open the lid and the bottom of the lid is covered in condensation, that tells me that there's not enough airflow. Condensation, moisture in your crops in storage is always a bad thing. It almost always leads to mold in storage. So if you're seeing condensation, you need more ventilation. So like if you're mid-season, you're not going to be drilling holes into a bin with things in it. So you can kind of crack the lid in order to give yourself enough airflow. On the flip side, if you are seeing softening of the veggies through moisture loss, then you need to come up with a way to make these things less, have less air exchange with the room around them. Some kind of classic bulb crates over in this picture here. This is a farm from North Carolina growing storage crops, which is interesting. They are using, and I use similar things like this. They're storing winter squash, which need a lot of airflow in these bulb crates. I do a similar thing, and I think it might show up in a photo later. I think in a high humidity storage room, cabbages and kohlrabi are things that really don't appreciate being in any kind of an enclosed container. Cabbages, the outer wrapper leaves will often start to mold and have a lot of issues if there's not enough airflow. Kohlrabi, it's the very last stub of the petiole. You've trimmed off the leaves, but then there's that very last piece that will come off in storage. But if the humidity is too high, it will turn to goo and rot to the inside of the kohlrabi, as opposed to just drying up and falling off or being able to be pulled off. This is what is going on the inside of these bins that I use. I usually like to have some kind of absorbent material because I'm putting these veggies in wet. And that absorbent material is kind of creating this moisture buffer. It's absorbing some of the early moisture and being a moisture source later on in storage season when things are a little drier in the storage room. For the past couple of years, I've been using peat moss covered by something that makes the peat moss not get all over the veggies because it's a pain to clean off. I've used burlap, but it can sometimes impart a taste on the veggies. Recently, I've been using chunks, relatively clean chunks of floating row cover from pieces that have been tattered. Did look it up. Floating row cover is a polypropylene plastic, which is the food safe type. I am gravitating towards moving to something like a couple layers of brown paper as the absorbent material on bottom. That would save me from buying the peat moss, and it's a little bit messy to clean up coming into the season. So I might be experimenting with that in the next year or two. But again, this is to absorb some of that moisture if you're putting things in wet. One thing I did my first season, I was using wood shavings as the absorbent material. Not a good idea for a couple of reasons. Well, the main reason being that it imparted a taste on the veggies. The other problem is that I was putting in veggies that were already dry onto a dry material. And that dry material sucked moisture out of the veggies. Any carrots that were touching those shavings became floppy because the shavings sucked moisture out of them. So if you're putting any kind of dry veggies, like you're not washing them up front, into like some kind of absorbent material on the bottom, it's a good idea to like pour a little bit of water into these bins or make sure that absorbent material is moist to start with so that they're not pulling moisture from your veggies and making them soft. Here's another cool example. This is back to that same farm in Winnipeg. There are other farms that use these things too. These are woven poly bags. They have a tight weave, but they have a tight enough weave that they pretty good at holding vapor, but not so tight that they don't allow a little bit of air exchange. So a lot of people use these to store their root crops in a dry storage room. These are similar to those like 50-pound grain sacks, and you can usually buy them in bulk. These folks say that they reuse the same bags over and over each year or year after year without having to do too much washing to them. They're also nice in that you can stack them. You can kind of do this Jenga pattern and stack a whole bunch of veggies into a limited amount of space. And they're cheap. Other farms use large pallet-sized bins. And when they do large pallet-sized bin, a theme that I see across farm after farm after farm is if their storage rooms are too dry, they use bin liners, but they don't put them in the bin. They put them on the outside of the bin, upside down. And so air is allowing, like there's air exchange that's happening on the bottom of the bin, and you might see a little bit of desiccation there, but the majority of things, or the majority of the veggies in the large bins are going to have the right amount of moisture and air, or fresh air, by having these bin liners upside down. So these are homemade bins. These are macro bins. It's kind of like a Kleenex. It's a generic name. There are macro bin. There's a company that makes macro bins, trademark, but not every plastic bin is a macro bin, but it's the name most people use for them. These are pretty expensive. I don't know of anybody in Alaska who has these. I've looked to getting them shipped up, and it's very expensive for trucking. And they're also quite expensive on their own. I think each bin can range from 150 to 300 each. But you know, these large farms can justify that expense. You know, you're pulling a lot of storage crops, and these bins are really durable and really easy to clean. So there's a good justification for having them. This is an example. Cabbages are in these bins, and they would do a great job for cabbages because they have a lot of airflow. And so you're going to leave a bin liner. You're not going to use a bin liner when you're storing cabbages because it will create too humid of an environment. Okay, so something about storage crops. Storage crops are not as valuable as our regular fresh harvested crops that we're used to selling at summer farmers markets. And so you need to harvest a lot of them to make money. And storage crops are heavy. So something that any storage farmer needs to think about is how they're going to move crops around the farm. A big part of our job, just like snow shoveling, is moving one thing from one place to another. There's a couple different scales I think about when I think about both storage containers and kind of like handling containers. There are the kind that are small enough to be lifted by hand, and there are the kind that aren't. I think there's not really much sense in using containers that are in the middle, because for cost and kind of like time efficiency wise, storage containers are usually the cheapest and the most efficient the larger that you go. But it means those large containers mean though that you need handling equipment that can handle them. At the small end, I think it's easy to overload, you know, what you're lifting by hand. You know, we want our bodies to last a lifetime of farming, not just a few years. And so I try to be really careful ergonomically about like how much I'm making myself and my employees lift at any given time. So these bulb crates, I talked to these farmers, and I think these hold about 50 pounds each. That's getting a little on the high end for my preference. I use, and I know a lot of farms that use 5-gallon buckets, because it limits how much you have to carry at any given time. Carrying 2 of them at a time kind of balances you out. So they're pretty ergonomic, and you can even use them to transfer into other larger containers. So I'm a huge advocate of 5-gallon buckets, and it's something that you can move around farm in a hand scale. Just like this, here's me moving my 5-gallon buckets in my little hand cart. I think I can put about 200 to 300 pounds in this cart at once. Sometimes I'll drive my truck into the field, but if it's been wet, you know, we're on a slope in Fairbanks here, and a little dicey at times if I drive my truck on the slope. Sometimes I'll also use my BCS to pull a trailer, but I find that the hand cart is easy enough. It's fast and maneuverable, and it's built in such a way that moving a few hundred pounds at a time is pretty easy on the body. Larger farms are going to use things like forklifts. You're going to have to lift these large bins. A lot of farms outfit their tractor with forks, and so they'll drive their tractor straight into the field with a large bin on its forks. Yeah, just like this. Or they'll use their tractor to have a pallet be a big surface then that they're going to put smaller containers onto, like these guys are. One more thing about lifting equipment, I'm looking into it right now myself. You don't necessarily need to buy a full-on forklift. They make smaller versions, hand versions called pallet stackers, that can lift sometimes up to 2,000 pounds. That might be either winch operated or hydraulic operated. So it's similar to a pallet jack, but it can lift sometimes up to heights of about 5 feet and operate in very small spaces. Oh, look, this is a rogue photo of my storage room. Again, so one thing I didn't talk about, apart from the large containers, I've been using these woven poly super sacks as my large storage containers because they can hold about 1,000 pounds of carrots or more, but they're like $20. So starting a farm, you're trying to keep things on the cheap as much as possible. These were a really great option for me. I think I'm going to start moving away from them because it makes storage in the storage room a little bit inefficient. I've had to build these kind of pallet racking to get another layer on because you can't stack these things on top of each other. But for the beginning, they've been great. I think they lack a little bit in airflow. And I would advise against anyone using just a cool bot system from loading these things too fast if the veggies are warm. This season in particular, I've seen some early rotting in certain crops that were loaded too fast when it was warm, and the cooling system couldn't cool them down fast enough, which is something to be aware of.
Hey Sam, I don't know if I asked while we were visiting. It's Keon.
Yeah.
Good to see you. How were you filling the sacks on the second level?
Oh yeah. So on the second level, I use a piece of rolling scaffolding and then lifting bins one by one. So this is part of this kind of like inefficient system of not having the handling equipment yet and needing to load and unload these bins in place, which I fully admit is a pain in the butt.
Would one of those pallet lifters, was it called? Would that go high enough to lift onto that?
Certain
Second-
ones would, yeah.
Okay.
And that would allow for a much better use of space. It's difficult to load veggies into these things because you're so close to the ceiling at that point. But if you could load them on the floor and then lift them up, that would be a lot more efficient time-wise, but also you'd be able to fit more in there. Just had a thought. It's gone. Maybe I'll come back to it. Any other questions?
I have a question about potatoes. You mentioned you don't grow them anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry. But when you did grow them, did you wait till the frost, killed the tops, or did you burn them or bushwhack them? Because it seems like sometimes we don't have that 1 to 3 week window.
Right. I was growing them in Michigan, so I was waiting until frost hit them. Although I know that the burning them or brush hogging them does work. I guess are you talking, so you guys don't have a window between like that first frost and then the soil freezing?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's probably quicker in Fairbanks, but sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. Sometimes,
Totally.
it just happens so fast.
Mm-hmm. And I I would say that you don't need to have like full dieback. Even a little bit of dieback is enough for those tubers to start setting. But you know, like if you're looking at, it's something that you'll just have to watch the forecast. Like if you're getting into early September or whenever your first frosts are coming, and you see that like, oh crap, there's a a patch of really cold weather coming forecasted in a couple weeks, you might want to think about uh, mowing down those tops and then pulling those potatoes out like right before that cold weather comes. It's kind of the gamble we play each year, trying to push things as late as possible. You always run into the risk of weather kind of thwarting you at the end. Okay. So in my farm, I have two main storage groups. I don't store potatoes. And I'm able to fudge, actually I have three groups, but I'm able to kind of fudge it. This, I can see what I'm talking about. Most of the crops fall into this like cold and damp group, and they like temperatures as close to freezing as you can get them, as high of humidity as you can get them. These are all the classic root crops. I think I've left a few off here, like turnips. Anything else? If I think of it, I'll say it. Another group is the cold and dry group. So all the alliums, onions, garlic, they will store best if they're kept right around freezing. But they really want to have dry conditions. Having the relative humidity around 65% is ideal. If you can't get that relative humidity or if you can't get those temperatures, it's much more important to keep them dry than it is to keep them cold. So I do store my onions and garlic in the same room as my winter squash, which is around 50 degrees and 60% relative humidity. And I don't grow enough of them that it becomes an issue, but you're much better off keeping them dry. Potatoes have a slightly different ideal temperature. You can store them down to about even like 33 degrees. 32 is kind of pushing it. You may start to see some mold issues if you're right around freezing. But between about like 33 and 38 degrees, you'll notice that potatoes are going to sweeten. And that may not be a problem. Your customers may not care, you may not care. It just means that when you fry them or pan sear them or whatever, they may brown or turn dark sooner because there's more sugars. I think ideal temperature for potatoes is around 38, although you can, like some people, keep them up to 45 degrees. It's just you'll see earlier sprouting at those higher temperatures. Move on. Okay, so unless you're doing a totally passive system, you're going to be trying to control the climate by some means. Usually in the fall, so I don't fire up my cool room until harvest starts. I'm using CoolBot systems. Here's an example of a CoolBot system, 2 air conditioners used in tandem. This is a farm in Michigan. Whatever you can do to make sure that you're keeping the room cold enough and that you're able to pull heat out of the veggies fast enough. One thing to note, and I'm kind of running into this now with my CoolBots, is that CoolBots are great at keeping things cold. They're not great at pulling heat out of things. They're just not powerful enough to do it. If you're moving up to more of like commercial skies refrigeration system, I think for a storage room like mine, which is like 12 by 24, I'd suggest getting nothing smaller than like 1 horsepower cooling system, but bigger is always better. The bigger your cooling system, the less moisture you'll pull out of the air. You may also be wondering if like running a CoolBot in really humid conditions screws it up. The answer is kind of. CoolBots can keep up even in really humid environments, but it like when you're getting really close to the saturation point, which is needed to keep your veggies from drying out, your CoolBots are going to start freezing up and they'll lose enough efficiency that they can't hold the temperature down. So early in the season, I'm kind of running this balance between keeping the room cold enough and the room humid enough. And often I'll drape like pieces of polyethylene sheeting over the veggies in order to like hold in a little bit of moisture just for that time that the room is a little bit too dry, so that I don't see desiccating veggies on top of the piles.
Hey Sam, can I ask, how long have your AC units typically lasted in your coolbot system? I just know sometimes when you're running them that hard, they can wear out pretty quickly. I'm just curious.
I've never seen one run out.
Okay.
I've heard of folks, yeah, I've heard of it happening, but I've never seen it. Mine have only been running for a couple years at this point. But again, I'm not, like I'm running mine only for like 1 month of the year.
If I could speak to that, I work on a mushroom farm and we need refrigeration for most of the year, or I mean, at least until it gets cold. And it's the routine maintenance that you want to keep up on, just making sure that your filters are clean, checking on it, making sure that you don't have a bunch of condensation on any of the electrical components, making sure it's well ventilated. So generally speaking, they'll last a pretty long time with like pretty consistent use. Yeah, but it also depends on like if you get secondhand or also if you know how to repair yourself. Usually a lot of times it's not too crazy of a thing to work on, but yeah, just depends on your competencies.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for chiming in.
I have
So
one more question about the Coolbot.
Yeah.
You said you're only running yours for about 1 month. Is that just because your storage area is so well insulated that you don't have to keep running it, and keep it from freezing?
right, so I run the CoolBot when the outside, so I start at the beginning of the harvest season when I'm starting to bring things in, and then I'm running it until outdoor temperatures are dropping below freezing. In which case I switch over to an air intake fan and use outside air to cool the room. If temperatures are still right around freezing, I'll keep the CoolBots running, making sure that I'm letting the water drain out from the bottoms. If you have, you can run the ACs during the winter, so long as ice is not going to impede the fans. They'll continue to run just fine and function well, but they're expensive to run, and so I'm usually trying to switch over to the air intake fan as soon as I can. This photo I took, you can see the outside temperature is -26. That room, the cool room, is well insulated enough and the veggies create enough heat that I still needed to be cooling the room at -26. That only lasted for maybe a few days. It kind of enough cold accumulated that I stopped needing to pull in cold air and eventually needed to add supplemental heat via just a small space heater. The way that I run my cooling fan, and this is a very low-tech way of doing it, you could buy and program a controller unit to do this for you too, but this also works, is that I take two thermostats, plug-in thermostats, and I plug the fan. So this cord is coming from the fan. I plug the fan into one, and then I plug that thermostat into another thermostat. This thermostat over here is watching the temperature inside the room. You see that the room is at 32 degrees. This thermostat kicks on if the room gets too warm, and it will kick off when the temperature reaches 32 degrees again, because I don't want to go below freezing. This thermostat kicks on if the outside temperature is below 32 degrees, because I don't want to be drawing too warm of air into the storage room, especially early in the season. Both of these thermostats need to be on in order for that fan to be on. So it kind of, I think of it like an if-then statement if you're into computer programming, but it's one thermostat's watching the outside temperature, one thermostat's watching the inside temperature, and they're both need to be on for this fan to kick on. This is just I don't have a photo of it here, but it's just a duct fan. I think this one pulls like 250 cubic feet per minute. That sounds right. Not a huge fan, but it's enough to bring cold air into the room, and it's cycling on and off to keep the storage room around 32 degrees. Now, as I am pulling cold air in from outside, that air is also dry, which means I need to constantly be, I'll come back to this, I need to constantly be adding humidity into the air. The way I do humidity or humidify the room is I have a commercial humidifier, which is a misting type. It's important to get a misting type because the wicking types, you'll run into like a physical limit around 90% relative humidity. So get a misting type. And this is just gravity fed by a bucket. And it is plugged into a humidistat. The humidistat is making sure that the room is staying, I think I have it set to like 97 right now. I know these things are notoriously bad at reading humidity at really, really high humidities. But I've just kind of played around enough to know that the veggies don't dry out at that humidity or that setting. So this is watching the humidity when dry air is being brought in through the fan. It's draining water from the bucket and kicking mist into the air. And I just need to make sure that I'm refilling the bucket. If it's near the freezing point outside and the fan is running a lot, I maybe need to refill the bucket every 4 or 5 days. If it's really cold outside and the fan isn't on that much, you know, sometimes it might be 2 weeks before I need to add water to the bucket. It's for me, it's been a great way to keep the humidity high. This is, if anybody wants later on, just contact me and I can pass along what brand and everything this is. But this commercial humidifier costs maybe $300 or something, but it does a great job. Stepping up from a cool bot is going to like a full-on commercial refrigeration system. Usually these have evaporators. So this is the evaporator fans. And these are going to be separated from the condensing units, which are usually outside. Some people use their condensing units to heat other areas of their packing or storage facilities, which is a great idea. These are always going to be really expensive. I had a system similar to this quoted like at $9,000 for me, which is why I'm still using CoolBots. But they do a much better job of pulling heat out of the veggies as they're coming in. A downside to these is that whenever things go wrong, you almost always need to have some kind of technician come out, unless you're an HVAC person yourself.
Hey, Sam, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You may have already touched base on this. I might have missed it, but do you not find any need to have the ability to add heat to your root storage?
I don't think I have a picture of it. I do have to add heat occasionally. I found we had a long cold snap here earlier, and the space heater, so it's just a space heater plugged into the same thermostat here. There's a heat setting, and that just small 1500 watt space heater needed to kick on when it was maybe below 25 below or something outside. Just kicking on occasionally.
But otherwise, the room just, is it the root vegetables kind of warming the room
It
up,
is,
or?
yeah. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you know, just like going back to, I'm going the wrong way. Going back to like this photo, you know, there's like 20,000 pounds of veggies in here, and they're all respiring and creating heat. And that ends up being quite a lot, you know, enough to heat a room when it's 20 below outside. The building is also really well insulated, so I'll have some pictures of the construction later, but the walls are like R35 and the ceiling is like R50, so it's, you know, pretty well insulated, but the veggies themselves do create some heat.
Awesome, thanks.
Yep. I'll try and move along here. Okay, so types of storage rooms. I just want to take you through, and this is again a point to jump in if you have questions, like take you through some different types of storage rooms I've seen on different farms and farmers that I've talked to. One cool idea, and this is I think this could work in Fairbanks, although I think you need maybe a little more insulation, but south of the Alaska Range, southeast especially, get yourself a reefer trailer. You know, these are just refrigerated shipping containers. They're already pretty well insulated, and you can carve out a hole in the side of them and install cool bot systems or any refrigeration systems that you need. This is a photo of one from, this one is also from North Carolina. Even though this one itself has all this refrigeration equipment in the back, they don't use it. They install cool bots and are able to store quite a lot of veggies in these things. And, you know, relatively speaking, they're not that expensive. You can get them shipped on site. They can sit on the ground. I know that Spinach Creek has a buried one. So if you can run some machinery and bury one of these things, this can be a pretty good storage option for you. I think if, you know, if you're in a place where winter is a little more intense, you might want a little bit more insulation. So kind of the downsides of these, well, the upside is that they're cheap and that it's kind of a ready-made structure. The downside is that the costs of heating them during the winter can add a lot to your operating costs. A lot of people will use walk-in cooler spaces that they use during the summer for their winter veggie setups. So this is a photo from a farm in Washington, and I liked this idea. They wanted a bigger cooler, and they bought some used cooler panels, and then they just built this pony wall and insulated that and put the cooler panels on top of it to gain some extra height. Same thing in the ceiling, they just kind of sister joined them up there. And so, you know, you have a lot of options with prefab cooler panels to use as both a summer and winter storage space. And I think these are great, especially when you're thinking about moisture issues that you may face with having like a double duty cooler like that. I haven't gone into vapor barriers at all, but if you're building a cooler yourself, something to be aware of is that where the vapor barrier should be in summer versus winter is flipped. It's opposite. And so if you're, one answer is to have a double vapor barrier and make the seal perfect, which is really hard to do. And that'll prevent you from having moisture build up in the wall in the summer or the winter when the vapor drive is flipping. If you're using, so if you're making a homemade cooler, just that's something to be aware of, that vapor barriers can be an issue if you're going to be using it both in the summertime and the wintertime. But using prefab cooler panels kind of gets you around that issue because they're metal on both sides. It's like foam sandwiched with metal, and vapor issues are not as big of a deal because metal can handle moisture. Let's see. Something you want to avoid. This is a photo from a farm in Vermont. They're renovating a barn here. I think I chose this picture because they're using fiberglass insulation. I really highly recommend against using fiberglass because fiberglass absorbs moisture. And just like I mentioned,
I'm gonna, I can't have control for the mute. So if you're off of mute, if you could take a share your on mute, or thank
did I
you.
do it? Okay, I think I did. Thumbs up. Okay. So fiberglass is going to absorb moisture, and when fiberglass becomes wet, in addition to having mold problems, it doesn't insulate as well. So you're going to have vapor drive coming either in the summertime or the wintertime, and if you're not doing a good job on your vapor barrier, which is really hard to do, if you're using your cooler in multiple seasons, fiberglass is going to become a huge problem for you. So even though it's cheap, don't use it. Please skip that. This is a photo of my storage room during construction. The half of the walls are these insulated concrete forms, and I think these are great for doing dug-in structures like mine is. So mine's partially dug into the ground. These insulated concrete forms allow you to set the forms yourself, or have minimal work for a contractor if you're hiring somebody. They're about R25 in themselves, and then whatever you get from the soil beyond. Back here are, so I use rock wool insulation in all places in my storage room because it doesn't absorb moisture, and if it does get wet, it retains its, well, so moisture is not going to permeate inside of it, but if the outer faces get wet, it's only mineral material, so it's nothing for, there's nothing for microbes or fungus to grow on, so you're not going to see fungal growth in this stuff. I also use this kind of staggered stud design in my storage room, so it's kind of like a double wall construction in order to break thermal bridging. So there's no spot where a stud is going to fully span the wall except at the base plates and the top plates. Any place that you have wood spanning like the full width of a wall, wood is not actually that great of an insulator, and so you're probably going to see cold spots forming in those locations, and I definitely do. There's a few places where a stud fully spans my walls, and I see freezing condensation in those places. Okay, trying to wrap things up because I know I'm going kind of long here. Just wanted to give you a few takeaways from farmers that I've talked to when asking them, like, okay, give some advice to people who are interested in doing some winter storage. And this is kind of what they came up with. So one is to be ready for a change in lifestyle, because when you're doing winter storage as part of like a commercial farm, you're not going to get that prolonged winter break anymore. You're going to be working, at least sometimes, all through the winter selling your crops. So just be aware of that. I think that for me, the benefit is my summers are much less intense than many of my traditional farming friends. I'm not prepping for market during the summer. I'm not packing veggies at all during the summer. I'm just focusing on growing the crops, and all the work that goes into selling and marketing and packaging and everything waits to the winter for me. So it makes my workload spread more evenly throughout the year. Many farmers also thought or said to think really carefully about how you're going to do materials handling, because storage crops are heavy, and you want to keep things ergonomic where you can, and just be aware that you're going to be moving around a lot of heavy stuff. I like this advice to start small, and that if you're interested in dabbling in storage, cabbages are a really great choice because they don't require any washing equipment in the winter or the fall. So you can put cabbage in storage. If the outer wrapper leaves look bad, you can just strip off a few layers, trim off the butt a little bit, and you've got a pristine, beautiful cabbage ready to go. Other advice is to make a harvest schedule and to stick to it. So like I was alluding to maybe an hour ago, sorry that I'm going kind of long, that I take a lot of time to schedule my harvest to make sure that I'm finishing on time and that all the crops are mature and ready when I'm harvesting them. Another thing is to expect losses in storage. So I'm a big proponent of planning for the worst and hoping for the best. I try and be pessimistic in not only my yields, but I plan in 10 to 15% loss in everything that I store. Sometimes I see that, but often I don't. And the excess, I'm usually able to find a wholesale market or a direct sale market for those things. And lastly, definitely cool those veggies quickly. It's really important to make sure that your veggies are cooling below 40 degrees as soon as possible when you're bringing them to storage. I know that I've left a bunch of things out. This is a huge topic, and there are so many things to talk about, but I would love to hear questions from you guys. I think I'm going to scoot all the way back to this chart so you can look at it and think about storage crops, dream about carrots.
So you're entering the end of your season of your winter, say. Are you gonna do a deep clean of your storage space?
I will, yeah. Usually the way it goes is I reach the end of my CSA, I reach the end of like kind of run out of my wholesale crops, and then I've got a bunch of seconds left. And I'll usually I'll figure out what my inventory is for those seconds, and I'll put out a message to my CSA customers and my other lists, and do like a spring sale where I'm selling seconds at half price, and people love that. And it's a great way for me to clean out my storage room. And then the actual deep clean, I sweep it out, sanitize the floors and walls where I can, and then I would prefer to clean the storage containers earlier in the season, but my main goal is getting those containers cleaned and sanitized before fall. So whenever I have time.
You're getting lots of praise in the chat here. Great
Oh, I'm
job.
not even watching. Maybe I'm gonna relinquish my screen sharing. Well, how do I stop?
Um,
Oh no. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay.
I can't wait to read the book. Thank you for doing this. This has been amazing and I learned so much.
Well, thanks a bunch.
How did your tomatoes go that you're having a little experiment
Oh
with?
man. I I'm not sold on them yet. Sakura is alluding to that. I found some storage tomatoes in Territorial's catalog, and I tried them out, and it was a variety that you harvest green and then they sit in storage for several months and slowly turn yellow. And I think it could work, but I didn't have the right storage conditions for them. They should be around like 50 degrees, but pretty high humidity. And my like warm room with the squash is just too dry for them. And so I was seeing a lot of desiccating, and because of that, like early rot in storage. And tomatoes are just kind of like a volatile crop, and so I like thinking about losing half of them to have a fun December sale just is not appealing to me. So maybe I'll grow them for myself, but I don't think I'm going to do it commercially. It just makes me too sad. Anybody else have any questions?
Well, I was just going to mention about the tomatoes. I volunteer at our local, I'm down in Ketchikan, and I volunteer at our Pioneer home and do some gardening stuff with some of the residents, sort of, kind of. And they have a little greenhouse. So there were all these tomatoes that just kept putting out. There was all cherry tomatoes. I don't even know what variety. So at the very end, I just cut them, all the vines, and then I just stuck the vines on a wire rack that's in there. And I just left them, and they continued to ripen.
Mm-hmm.
And for months. So I was, every Friday morning when I'd be there, I'd be eating some of these cherry tomatoes that I just left on the vines. And I was really shocked about how they stayed okay
Mm-hmm.
for
Yeah,
months.
I also have I have a few tomatoes that even in March that are still good. And I may actually eat some tonight. The main issue that I find is that I have to kind of set, and if you're going to be doing this commercially, you have to find like an acceptable amount of loss. And I usually set that around like 25 or 30%. Because at around that point, it becomes not worth it, like space wise, to grow it if you're going to lose so much before you can sell them. I'm fully on board with people growing tomatoes for home use, and maybe there's a way to do it. I think if you have a situation that's like working really well and you can store these tomatoes into December, that's so cool. I'm so excited. I would love to hear more about it. Yeah, definitely. Maybe the mushroom people can, maybe that's the right conditions. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah.
I really hope that you take the opportunity to apply for the RSFI grant that's out for equipment. And
I am filling it out right now. I'm asking for the moon.
good, as you should.
Yeah.
I think there was one more question in the chat from Raven, asked if you have folks come and volunteer and at your farm.
Yeah, occasionally. Have let's see. I will put my email into the chat, and I do have folks coming and volunteering occasionally.
Sweet.
Although I welcome volunteers for a short amount of time, but I'm adamant about paying people if they are going to be sticking around for longer. I've done too much free work in my life. I don't know. Is this going to send? No, it's not sending.
Got you.
Okay, thank you, Kira.
Sam, I have a question for you. What are you moving from your bags you're doing in storage now? What are you moving to?
Ooh, well, if I have I'm thinking about either going to wooden pallets, like bulk bins, or plastic bulk bins, and that's part of my giant request to the USDA in that grant application. I think if I keep using the bags, I'm going to add some holes to them for ventilation, and I may, like, especially when it's warm outside and I'm harvesting, I may leave the veggies in smaller containers for a while to cool before loading them into the bigger containers. Because
Right
I
on.
think, like in the center of those big bags, they're just not cooling fast enough.
One other thing is that sometimes the military sells like surplus pallet jacks
Oh, sweet.
on the auction for really cheap. So that could be a resource.
Totally. Sweet. Do you know what time they do it? Is it like random?
I don't know. My boss at Rissy's just is like on the auction sites all the time. And I think it's just when they're like upgrading their machinery stuff. But he got like 3 electric pallet jacks for incredibly cheap because they just didn't want them. And
He has
nobody,
3 of them.
yeah, 3 of them.
Oh
So
man.
auctions.
Maybe if I grovel, they'll sell one to me.
Yeah, maybe I could ask.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of niche to want, such a small kind of limited pallet jack, but we're working in small spaces with limited resources, and so things have to be maneuverable.
Yeah, it's crazy. This farm that I've been working on in Kentucky, like for several seasons, they're huge. They grow on 35 acres of organic veggie production, and they spray everything by hand. Like it's like the craziest thing. They used to have a little like sprayer system, but then they decided it was inefficient, and so they just have never gotten a new one, and they spray everything
You
by
know what?
hand.
And that's their choice. I am fully on board with people deciding what works for them. At the end of the day, you're the one who has to live with it.
Yeah, I can't imagine your arm spinning 10,000.
Yeah, my shoulder got tired.
Yeah, my shoulder got tired for you when you said it out loud.
You better imagine it, because we've got a broken culvert that is exactly like that.
I think the hand turned version, I want to say it was like $100 to build, between lumber and fasteners and PVC and everything. So I mean, as far as barrel washer goes, that's really cheap.
Well, she's got a broken culvert and a cheap partner, so
Sweet.
I think we'll be on that route for a little while.
Yeah. Oh, I think the other thing I didn't mention is that I always, the barrel, like if you're spraying on one end of the barrel, veggies come shooting out the other end. And so you want to put something on the front that's going to stop them from shooting out. My current thing is another transfer station find. I think it was like a wire rack from a freezer that I have hinged on to one end.
Oh, yeah, we've got a few of those lying around too, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just do like a Zoom, like a video call. You're like, yeah, grab that, grab that,
Yeah.
grab that.
Oh, that's fun. All right, well, if, are there any other questions?
Just, I think you've so much to chew on. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing, Sam, and giving us your time and your knowledge, and make sure that you drop us a link when your book comes out.
Mhm. Yeah, should be this fall, but I will let you know.
Ooh, could I ask one question before you get going?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I really like the paradigm shift between crazy summer growing season, doing all the things all the time constantly, to like a more spread out growing and harvesting period. And I was wondering like what that transition was like for you, and were you able to like, yeah, what was that lifestyle like rather than the traditional, Alaskan summer of frenzy and manic?
I mean, it's hard for me to talk about a transition because as far as like me farming on my own, I've only ever done storage farming. Um, I've worked for other folks in the crazy lifestyle, but I've only ever like run the show in this style of farming. Originally, it started because I was in grad school and I just like didn't have time to run a traditional farm, and so I was working with a farmer mentor at the time, and they came up with the idea of doing a winter CSA as a means of kind of like spreading the workload throughout the year and allowing me to farm. But uh, I just found that I liked it so much compared to how stressed everybody else seemed to be, and finding that like the winter marketplace was so wide open and people were so eager that it just kept me coming back.
Wow, awesome. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
yeah, really wanting to live a slower life and yeah, just be more sustainable about it because it's a pretty intense industry. Cool. Thank
Yeah,
you.
totally.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah.
We'll follow
Thanks,
up with
Sam.
questions later on.
Sounds great. Yeah, I was so psyched to give this talk. I'm happy that everybody's here and looking forward to more of these sessions because they are great.
Ditto. Same.
Thanks, Sam.
Good luck
Thanks,
finishing up your
everybody.
book, Sam. Appreciate it.
Okay. All right, I'm going to cut the meeting. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Sam. Thank you again.